Good afternoon and happy 2023 International Day of Peace. My name is Asher Kaufman and I'm the director of the Kroc Institute. The International Day of Peace was established in 1981 by the United Nations General Assembly. 2 decades later, in 2001, the General Assembly unanimously voted to designate the day as a period of non-violence and ceasefire around the world. They heard the non-violence and ceasefire. And the alarm goes off. Must have been told. Just a building experiment. Anyway, non-violence and ceasefire around the world. Without checking, I didn't actually check to verify, but I am confident that there is not even one single area of conflict around the world where this day is being observed through non-violence and ceasefire. The 2001 resolution, and I quote, invites all member states, organizations of the United Nations system, regional and non-governmental organizations and individuals to commemorate in an appropriate manner the International Day of Peace, including through education and public awareness, and to cooperate with the United Nations in the establishment of the global ceasefire. Still waiting for the establishment of this global ceasefire, but the minimum that we can do is education and public awareness, and this is why we are here. It has become a tradition at the Kroc Institute to convene a panel that addresses the annual theme chosen by the United Nations for this day. This year's theme is Action for Peace, our ambition for #global goals, which is connected to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals intended to create a culture of peace around the world. This year, we decided to slightly divert from the practice of responding to the annual theme, and instead discuss the policy brief that the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres launched on July 20th, titled A New Agenda for Peace, which focuses on the future of multilateral security cooperation, and in many ways is still connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. The last time a UN Secretary General issued an agenda for peace was in 1992. It was a foundational text back then about concerning the UN role in stabilizing the post-Cold War world, and it envisioned an activist, interventionist UN that would set the terms for policy discussions around the organization in the following 3 decades. It focused on preventive diplomacy, peacekeeping, peace enforcement, and post-conflict peacebuilding. This 2023 new agenda for peace was issued in an entirely different global context, where conflict and violence in all of its forms are on the rise, and where the UN capacity to manage these global challenges is being questioned. Since 2009, there has been a steady increase in conflicts around the world, as documented by the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, and the UN has been seriously weakened. Perhaps this is the reason why Guterres' new agenda for peace focuses less on what the UN can do, in contrast to the 1992 new agenda for peace, and puts the onus more on member states of the organization. Only 2 days ago, on September 19th, Guterres warned of a looming great fracture in the world, describing existing global governance structures such as the United Nations as failing to serve a changing world. He called for sweeping changes to multilateral institutions, including reforming the Security Council which is at the heart of the United Nations, and redesigning the global financial systems. So with this optimistic overview of the state of the globe, we will now turn to our distinguished panel, this battery of panelists and experts who are in front of you all. They're all experts on peace and international system, and they will help us unpack the new agenda for Peace. I'll be very brief with introductions, just the name and the title, and each one of them will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will respond to each other's comments for a few minutes, and then open it up for Q&A. So first is Aaron Graham, Associate Professor of Global Affairs at the Kroc School of Global Affairs. Myra Hayat, Assistant Professor of Environment and Peace Studies. Lisa Shirk, Richard G. Starman, Senior Professor of the Practice of Peace Studies. And Josefina Echavarria Alvarez, Professor of the Practice and Director of the Peace Accords Matrix. And zooming in from Trio is Lori Nathan, Professor of the Practice of Mediation, the Mediation Program Director. And we start with Aaron, 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Asher. Good afternoon, and thank you, Asher, for inviting me to participate in a Kroc event. I appreciate it. So my mandate today is to talk about this new document, the New Agenda for Peace, in the context, the broader context of multilateralism and United Nations reform. And I'll start off echoing a few of the things Asher just said about the potential and limits of multilateralism at the UN, and how they vary over time, depending on how international politics is going, who has power in the system, and how well or poorly they're getting along with one another. So when we think back to the original Agenda for Peace in '92 at the close of the Cold War, on the first page it said this, I'll just read a brief quote. The United Nations is a gathering of sovereign states, and what it can do depends on the common ground they can create between them. The adversarial decades of the Cold War made the original promise of the organization impossible to fulfill.
There is a request that you raise your voice.
That's what I wanted to.
Louder still? Okay.
I think that's.
It is. I'll talk a little bit louder. I don't know how much louder I can talk. That made the organization, the promise of the organization impossible to fulfill. In these past months, it says a conviction has grown among nations large and small that an opportunity has been regained to achieve the objectives of the Charter. And it lists, maintaining international peace and security, human rights, etc. So by contrast, our new Agenda for Peace that dropped over the summer says things like this. The post-Cold War period is over. The unity of purpose expressed in the early 1990s has waned. And on page 15 of this document, it says, the world we are now in is one in which nuclear annihilation and a third world war are no longer unthinkable. At some points, the document longs for the Cold War. It talks about confidence building measures and crisis management mechanisms that, quote, helped forestall direct confrontation among the major powers, and talks about how these mechanisms and practices have deteriorated since then. So the difference in the documents is quite stark, but in some ways the language can also be a bit misleading. It sort of gives the sense that in 1992, sovereign states were really on the same page with regard to how they wanted to see the UN, what they wanted it to become, and that they were really committed to achieving the promise of the Charter. And I would say before without discounting sort of the optimism of the end of the Cold War, we have to look at the very stark geopolitical differences between that period and this one, right? And so China had not yet risen in '92. A lot of people still thought the European Union or Japan might be the next superpower. Russia was obviously in a period of economic disarray and uncertainty following the end of the Soviet Union. And so more than any spirit of solidarity, we just had a time in which the United States was sort of sitting alone as the major power in the system. And so what changed in a really measurable way is the distribution of power. And so what we hear from the Secretary General, both in this document and also in the interviews he's been doing ahead of the General Assembly in New York, is talking about how difficult any agreement and multilateralism at the UN will be in this context. And so I think that the question that emerges in a time like this is, what does the UN say? Like, what does the voice of the UN say in this context? What does the Secretary General say? And what sort of recommendations are worth making? And it seems to be what he does in the document is at least threefold. First, the document is clear-eyed about the state of affairs. It doesn't shy away from articulating the urgency or severity of the crises we face, whether that's violence, climate inequality. He gives substantial space to new threats, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence. But while sometimes we think of the UN as being idealistic, the subtext of this document is really great power politics and the realities of great power politics. And in some ways, I read this as a warning that he's issuing, and in the interviews that he's doing, is that unless we overcome the divisions among the superpowers, we're not going to see a lot of action on these other urgent issues. And what we're going to see is a lot of energy and space being taken up by this concern for a world war or a nuclear war, rather than spending resources and time and energy on the climate crisis or other things in need of our attention. Second, rather than ambitious calls for reform, although I'll get to a couple of those in a second, much of what's done in the report is calling on the member states to abide by their current obligations under the Charter. And to make use of tools of the United Nations that already exist and have existed for a long time, rather than ignoring those tools. One of the places we see this is the attention given to Article 33 of the UN Charter, which is on the Pacific settlement of disputes. He says, we don't demand new tools. The tools are there. What we need is the will of member states to utilize those tools. And there's sort of similar language on other topics in the document. There are some important calls for reform around UN peacekeeping, peace building, and disarmament issues. There's a call for nuclear disarmament, which I'll set aside and not mention, but there are some really ambitious asks in the document. And so I think in this context that we are talking about, that's a difficult geopolitical context, it's useful to think about what sort of reforms are possible and what sort of things can change in a period like this, because the UN did change in important ways throughout the Cold War when we had a lot of division, and so it's not impossible that some changes can occur. So for anyone who follows the UN, one of the longest standing reform issues has to do with the expansion of the permanent membership of the Security Council. There's no permanent seat from the African continent, from South America. There's no permanent seat from the Islamic world. And the new agenda for peace does call for this reform. But it calls for other Security Council reforms to democratize its procedures, by which it means things like a more broad consultation among the Council outside the permanent 5 members, consultation with host states, consultations with troop contributing countries, in order to be more inclusive about who has influence and is heard in those discussions of the Council. There's also talk of increased accountability around the veto at the Security Council. So if I were to, just assess those things, I would say anything that requires a charter revision, like dealing with the veto or even expanding the membership, although the Biden administration is supportive of that from time to time in different ways, those are probably not going to happen. On the other hand, the practices of the Security Council can evolve over time and have evolved over time, and there's no reason that we shouldn't see a more inclusive consultation process at the Security Council. There's no reason that it could not move in that direction, and there have been over the years movements with regard to communication with troop contributing countries. There's 2 other proposals that I'll just mention briefly that I think in some ways are a sign of the times. There's a proposal that's been around for a while, but seems to be gaining some momentum about the possibility of the UN using its mandatory assessment system to pay for a large portion of African Union peace support operations. African Union peace support operations are generally well regarded for their local expertise and also their legitimacy on the continent, but they're poorly funded. One potential reform is to use the UN's system of mandatory peacekeeping dues to support a large portion of these missions. And there's some obstacles to that being passed in the Council, but it does look like it's being taken more seriously. And that would be a pretty, from the perspective of someone who studies the UN and change, that would be an interesting expansion of the mandatory assessment system at the UN. The other one that I'll note before handing this over is that one thing that happened a lot during the Cold War, not a lot, but sometimes, is that the General Assembly would raise its voice and sometimes actually affect action in the realm of international peace and security. That's often controversial because the Charter gives the primary role to the Security Council. However, we do see the Secretary General endorsing this in the realm of disarmament. It calls for the revitalization of the General Assembly on disarmament issues, and it explicitly says in cases where the Security Council is blocked. And so that's something where the Secretary General is endorsing something that for some is controversial. So just to sum up, I'm at about 9 minutes. overall, we have a kind of a clear-eyed view of the geopolitical situation. We have the Secretary General sort of pleading with the membership to utilize the United Nations system, and at the same time, not ignoring some of the longstanding reforms that have been asked for by the developing world. And so with that summary, I'll hand it over to whoever is next. I forget. Myra.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
Thank you for the invite. Thank you to everyone for being here. I will start with two short excerpts from the new agenda for peace. Is the volume okay? Number one.
You're gonna ask Lori.
Number one. I'm quoting from the document. Where record temperatures, erratic precipitation, and rising sea levels reduce harvests, destroy critical infrastructure, and displace communities, they exacerbate the risks of instability, in particular in situations already affected by conflict. They may also create new, unanticipated areas of contestation, leading to new or resurgent disputes related to territorial and maritime claims. Climate policies and green energy transitions can offer avenues for effective peace building and the inclusion of women, indigenous communities, the economically disadvantaged, and youth. However, they can also be destabilizing if not managed properly. End quote. And the second excerpt is what's called Action 6 in the document, which reads as follows. Address the interlinkages between climate, peace, and security. It is this linkage, explicit in something like Article 6, less so in the general text of the document, that I would like to direct your attention towards and invite us to probe. There is widespread securitization of peace discourse today, and it is very problematic because it is organized around a foundational binary. Securing whom against whom? Parts of the global south have long been viewed and described in such terms: threatening, falling apart, disorderly, and of course, the source of insecurity if not managed well. To borrow from the new agenda, destabilizing if not managed properly. But this is an unsatisfactory view of not just unequal relations between the global south and north, which cannot be understood apart from longer colonial histories, but also an unsatisfactory view of climate change. A changing climate will be and is being experienced through existing structures and realities. It is a multiply and heavily mediated experience. People's experience and navigation of climate change realities will not be in categories. The political persecution part of my day, the religious discrimination part of my day, the climate change part of my day. Climate change will most likely manifest along the same axes that have long fashioned the structural violence of the contemporary. People in low-lying areas will be endangered first and more by rising seas. People living in and amid poor infrastructure will suffer first and more. People drinking polluted water, those living nearer pollution sources, will suffer first and more. Who are these people? The religious, caste, gender, and racially marginalized. Human geography is a pretty accurate archive of structural violence. At a time when there is increasing securitization of climate discourse, one important step could be to remember some old conversations in peace studies. Expanding understanding of violence, broadening definitions such that peace was incomplete without, did not make much or any sense without being focused on, anchored in, and obsessed with injustice. Such relations are already being asserted by UN personnel themselves. Tendai Achiume, the 5th UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, wrote in her report to the General Assembly last year, I quote, "Climate justice seeks historical accountability from nations and entities responsible for climate change, and calls for a radical transformation of the contemporary systems that shape the relationship between humans and the rest of the planet. The status quo is that global and national systems distribute the suffering associated with the global ecological crisis on a racially discriminatory basis," end quote. Achiume goes on to assert the responsibility of colonial pasts, I quote, "The nations least capable of mitigating and responding to ecological crisis have been rendered so both by histories of colonial domination and by externally imposed neoliberal and other economic policies in the post-colonial era, end quote. So, not naturally poor or randomly poor, forever failing, falling apart, or about to fall apart because of climate change, but the consequence of history and politics, of bad relations of exploitation and extraction. So, where does this leave us today? A situation that looks something like this. In terms of what some scholars have called excess resource use of the ecological commons, the US takes up the largest proportion at 27%. Research at Brown University has shown that since the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan, the US military has emitted more than 1,200 million metric tons of greenhouse gases, making it a larger emitter than many countries combined. Pakistan, where my work has been concentrated, is among the 58 countries collectively home to a population of 3.6 billion people that have remained within what these scholars are calling fair shares of resource use vis-a-vis the ecological commons. Yet countries like Pakistan are the worst affected by global warming. Last year, it was devastated by floods that left nearly a third of it underwater. But this suffering tends to be narrated here in a way that emphasizes corruption and mismanagement in the global south, discounts Western responsibility, and discredits the reparative aspects of loss and damage claims. Loss and damage refers to impacts of climate change that cannot be adapted to. Put simply, it is too late for anyone to prepare against these. Over 70% of climate adaptation finance given by the global north is dispersed as loans, not grants. The economic cost of loss and damage in developing countries has been estimated at anywhere between $290 to $580 billion by 2030, rising to, by some estimates, $1.8 trillion by 2050. And yet, calls for establishing a loss and damage facility by the Group of 77 in China were blocked by developed countries at Glasgow, at that year's climate conference in Glasgow. It was formally announced, though, in Sharm el-Sheikh last year, so it remains to be seen how quickly this starts working and how it will work. Climate change should alarm and concern us, not because some people somewhere are scared of others elsewhere breaking into war, violence, and conflict, or coming to our shores, but because we are where we are today because of shared joint histories of exploitative relations and colonial rule and ongoing inequalities evidenced by, as just one example, the high debt to GDP ratios of the less wealthy parts of the world, or even more recently, COVID vaccine apartheid of the last 2 or 3 years. It is not about helping the less fortunate out of the goodwill of the heart or ability of the pocket. It is about owning up and accepting responsibility and repairing. A positive and just peace, as scholars and practitioners in the business of peace have long shown, is a worthwhile goal, far more worthwhile than securing and defending, which are premised on excluding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ira. And our next speaker is Lisa Scher. Please.
All right, thank you. I'd like to start by just giving a little background on this Agenda for Peace, remembering the impact that the first Agenda for Peace in 1992 really had on the field of peace building, because before that date, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of civil society groups calling their efforts peace building, but suddenly we had the United Nations sort of giving official cover to the work that we did and really heightening the profile of the work of peace building as legitimate and really then creating an international architecture of peace building. So at the time we thought this was great news, but actually what ended up happening in the decade after 1992 is this whole new generation, mostly of political scientists, began studying peace building and tracing the origin of peace building to the United Nations. So you suddenly heard people saying that the concept of peace building began in 1992. I'm looking at Teklo Anjala here in the audience, who was working at peace building with her Kenyan colleagues for at least 2 decades before that. So in some senses, here you have the United Nations already, a global governance of states that at times really has left out and seen civil society as the enemy or as irrelevant. And, I think in hindsight, I look back at the first Agenda for Peace as this real missed opportunity to give civil society the credit for the field of peace studies, which we really created and innovated. So in thinking about this International Day of Peace, I think we need to also kind of remember the history of the field of peace studies, how we got here, and remember that it really started with small groups of people sitting at kitchen tables in the Philippines, in Guatemala, in Kenya, and many other countries, doing the hard work of peace on the ground. And that evidence base that grew up that it can work it trickled up to the United Nations and became this international infrastructure for peace building, which has had good and bad impacts on civil society. What really struck me about this report is how sophisticated the linkage was between all the different crises. I call them the panoply of crises, between the climate crisis, nuclear weapons, governance, economic, technology. It's not like you can pick them apart and say this is something we need to work on. They're now really interconnected. And while each of us here on this panel are talking about discrete parts of the report, I think it's important to say that the report links them, and in our peace building, we need to have the approach of an integrated approach where everything we do should be climate sensitive. Everything we do should think about technology and how we're using it, etc. There are a few lines from the report that I want to read, but first of all, I want to read this quote from Stanford biology professor E.O. Wilson, who said, "The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology." And of course, this was referring mostly to nuclear weapons, how we built machines that we can't control, referring to nuclear weapons that now destroy the world over many times. And of course, now we're still coming to terms with this with movies like Oppenheimer, and a whole new generation of technology that we again cannot control. So generative artificial intelligence is mentioned quite heavily in the report. Because it's sort of like in the last year, many of us in this room are realizing what this new machine that humans have built, again, funneled from universities like this one, where so much money and attention goes to STEM, science and technology, but without the governance and without the institutions that are maturing at the same speed as the technology. So I really like this quote from E.O. Wilson because it starts with the Paleolithic emotions, which really artificial intelligence preys on our really immature impulses as human beings to be able to influence others and to compare ourselves to others. So you can look at the artificial intelligence in social media and look what it's doing to our youth. But I think really what he's talking about in terms of the more pressing threat is the 70+ national elections that will happen in 2024, including here in the United States, and the way artificial intelligence will be used to spread false propaganda, to undermine democratic institutions, and to really undermine those elections. We already know the shift towards autocratic regimes and that we have democracies electing autocrats. And the way that is happening is really, I would say, significantly contributed to by technology, by social media, by false propaganda, by persuasive communications aimed at our Paleolithic emotions that have not matured over time, just like our institutions, including the United Nations, has not matured at the rate that the technology has advanced us. So in the report, I think the Secretary General is aware of the fragility of global governance that many of us are thinking about. And he names the threats and the solutions. One of his quotes that I have here, even the most securitized of borders cannot contain the effects posed by the warming of the planet, the activities of criminal groups or terrorists, and the spread of deadly viruses. So it's as if the pandemic, technology, and the climate crisis all have shouted at us this kind of medieval state system that you have evolved is nothing when it comes to a pandemic or to nuclear threats or technology. The nations can't contain themselves from these threats because these are threats that are transnational, they cross borders. We saw that certainly this summer with the Canadian wildfire smoke that ended up here in our pristine environment. So borders have become almost fantasies when it comes to international peace and security. And we have incidents involving the malicious use of digital technologies by state and non-state actors, increasing in scope, scale, severity, and sophistication. I think at that point, you know, he sort of switches in the report from identifying these threats and this panoply of interrelated crises to what can the UN do? As my colleagues have said, you know, focusing on states, giving the UN a platform, inviting the UN to play leadership roles. And he names civil society in this report in a way that I wish he had named, wish the UN had named civil society in 1992 in the first Agenda for Peace. But I think, you know, this trying to imagine how these new technologies might support more participatory democracy. So not just having a representative United Nations where heads of states interact with each other and do diplomacy. How now can citizens be involved in discussing climate policies, all the issues we're talking about, because actually technology enables us to have a much more robust participatory democracy with many of the new platforms that really enable people to listen to each other at scale. And the platforms that I'm working with colleagues in San Francisco are generating incentives for people to find creative solutions between stakeholders across the lines of polarization. One of the things that he mentions in the report is the urgent need to update international law to address threats from new technologies. So there's discussion elsewhere in the world on a digital Geneva Convention, on the need by 2026 to have a legally binding instrument to prohibit lethal autonomous weapons that function in militaries without human control. The stuff of Hollywood's fantasies, of course, we've been seeing movies about this for years and now it's upon us. So we need new national strategies to mitigate threats from AI, artificial intelligence, and we need civil society movements really much more actively working with the United Nations to develop ethics and policies and regulations that end the profit motivation for these new weapon systems. So here in the United States, in close, there is a movement called Stop Hate for Profit that mostly targets Facebook and Twitter. And the goal of that is to say the profit motive and structure of Facebook, Meta, generates polarization, undermines elections. And as long as we have massive business models that are benefiting from conflict and polarization, our work of peace building is so much more difficult. Thank you.
I'll move to Josefina, please. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Asher. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm so glad to see so many students and so many visitors too. And thank you, Asher, for this invitation. I was tasked with commenting a little bit on the aspects of conflict prevention that were included in the common agenda. So first, I want to share with you that I find that these three principles upon which the common agenda is based trust, solidarity, and universality, you can find that those are really core principles of, I would not just say violence prevention, but conflict transformation and conflict resolution. Of course, within this document, you don't find a very in-depth or sophisticated elaboration of why trust is important in conflict prevention, but I think is fundamental to create not just mechanisms for trust and confidence building, but overall, in order to transform conflict, just the idea that the person or the party in front of you is being honest is fundamental. Trust us to also not just in one another, but in a common future. And I think that to realize that these national sovereign disputes in the end divide us more politically, where we're all sharing the same planet, we're breathing the same air. And in the end, yes, I agree. I think that multilateralism can only be the solution, but I do believe that there are almost these limits that are inevitable when the Secretary General of the United Nations, which is an organization that is based on national interest, calls on multilateralism. So I think that this, in general terms, these three principles of trust, solidarity, and universality, you can say can be wonderful for conflict prevention. The way that conflict and violence prevention is then developed in the agenda is really interesting. On the one hand, it speaks about shifting prevention and sustaining peace within countries. I think is one of the most interesting aspects of the whole agenda, that it first not only speaks about political violence, but it also speaks about macrocriminality, and it speaks about domestic violence, which I think is a necessary aspect of it all. It always shows a problem, and then when it comes to the recommendations, it highlights the importance of member states of, again, cleaning their own backyard for facing global threats, which I think is very limited. The following action is about accelerating the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I think this is one of those agendas that has, you've heard a lot about it in so many of your peace studies courses. The idea is, how can we try to bring together, again, nation states to face global threats? It tends not to work because the national interest prevails over multilateralism and the principle of solidarity. But then I very much like the following action, which I think is maybe something new in relation to the 1990s. It brings in the transformation of gender to power dynamics in peace and security. And this is one of the most interesting aspects of it, because it not only recognizes gendered and sexual-based violence as one of the most important types of violence that the United Nations needs to confront, and all of us, of course, but it also basically accepts that there has been a very low implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which has been one, I think that the most successful global agenda of the United Nations ever. And it says we have not had any sort of important implementation since maybe 2009. So more than 10 years ago was the last time that you really see an improvement in the implementation of the not only the original resolutions of 2000, but the whole global agenda. It then moves on to climate change that Maya was commenting upon. It is really difficult to try to create a multilateral consciousness when all your structures are based on nation states. And the last one is to reduce the human cost of weapons. I think that this is also, as Lisa was saying before, this has been a topic in the UN agenda since the middle and the end of the 90s, which is the idea how weapons that are managed and directed by artificial intelligence simply do not know what international humanitarian law means, and therefore there is no moral compass of these weapons. All this to tell you that I believe that the principles upon which this new agenda is organized are very much in line with conflict prevention and violence prevention. I think that the introduction of other forms of violence besides political violence, like crime and gender-based violence, is extremely important for the way we can map out those conflicts and which kind of violence really matters to us in our everyday. However, if I was to create a matrix to be able to understand
Another one we want.
what are these commitments, can I observe them, can I measure them, and can I verify them? I would say they fall short of being any sort of real commitments most of the time, because they don't really identify who is the party responsible. But when it does, it takes away the United Nations, which is the organization that is producing the statement. This creates an incoherence that very likely will result in very low implementation rates. So there is no way you can hold the United Nations accountable for this type of commitments, because they're not making the commitments in their name. So what could you do if you were, I agree with Erin, it gives the impression at the beginning to be an idealist agenda. It ends up being quite neo-realist and neo-institutionalist. But it's still, you could say, I can create a movement, I can lead this type of commitment in which I am not the main driver, but for that you need political power. For that you need leadership. For that you need to recognize that the very foundations of your organization are created by nation states that are extremely blind when it comes to global threats and global responses. I do believe that the situation that we find ourselves since February last year, with the war of aggression from the Russian Federation against Ukraine, has delegitimized the United Nations even more. And so I thought, what could I say? So I said, if I had the opportunity to speak with Antonio Guterres, I would just dedicate a poem to him. And so I said, I'm going to start with this book that is called Still Possible by David White, to tell him, is it still possible that you can actually strengthen the United Nations? Then I started reading the poems and I couldn't find any single one of them. So I said, I'm going to go with John O'Donoghue just because we are at the University of Notre Dame and everything is Irish here. So I have one poem. It's not the entire poem, fits for Guterres, but I would just say this to him. For one who holds power, may the gift of leadership awaken in you as a vocation. Keep you mindful of the providence that calls you to serve. As high over the mountains the eagle spreads its wings, may your perspective be larger than the view from the foothills. I'm afraid he's still looking from the foothills up, but I am. That would be my gift on the International Day of Peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Josefina. Laura, can you hear us?
Yep, I can hear you fine.
Good. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Asha. Friends, colleagues, sorry I'm not with you in South Bend, Indiana. I'm going to start by just reading one of the comments from the SG, the Secretary General, with respect to what he refers to as the changing nature of armed conflict. And he says that civil wars, which still represent the vast majority of conflicts today, are increasingly enmeshed in global and regional dynamics. Close to half of the conflicts in 2021 were internationalized. And he goes on to say that this has increased the risk of direct confrontation among external actors, who in certain situations have become conflict parties in their own right. Now, by complete coincidence, I am not with you at Notre Dame. I am in Oslo attending a workshop on exactly this topic. The theme of the workshop is mediation in regionalized interstate conflicts. And this workshop forms part of a new research project led by the Kroc Institute together with PRIO, the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. And we're doing policy research, which is to say we seek, firstly, to deepen understanding of the nature of the problem based on research, and second, to generate potential solutions to the problem based on research. In other words, to generate evidence-based rather than only normative solutions. We've identified 4 dimensions of the problem that the Secretary General raises in relation to regionalized conflicts, and I'll summarize them briefly. First dimension of the problem is that neighboring states, and in some cases major powers, US, China, or Russia, become involved in a domestic interstate conflict as conflict parties, not as peacemakers, as conflict parties. They may be arming or providing funding to the domestic conflict parties. They may also be directly involved in military activities inside that country. And examples here, contemporary examples include Syria, Yemen, and Sudan, where you have major internal conflict where external actors are conflict parties. And this dynamic makes mediation much, much more difficult than it would otherwise be, because you have a greater number of conflict actors, you have a greater number of issues, you have a greater number of incompatibilities, you have a greater number of interests, you have a greater number of competing norms, and the different actors are operating at different levels and as part of different systems. So a mediator in Syria or Sudan or Yemen has to mediate not only at the domestic level, but also at the regional system and at the international system. And these systems are different. They have different dynamics and logics. So the job of the mediator becomes much more difficult. Second dimension of the problem is that we have seen growing competition between the mediators or potential mediators. And this is extremely harmful to peace processes. In Sudan currently, there are numerous mediators and wannabe mediators. There is a US-Saudi Arabia initiative, the United Nations and the African Union and IGAD, which is the regional body for the Horn of Africa, are meant to be partners, but they are approaching the conflict in divergent ways. In the case of Syria, Russia mounted a mediation that directly competed with and undermined the United Nations mediation. In the case of Darfur, the United Nations and the African Union were partners in a mediation, but the conflict between their respective mediators was so great that one of the rebel movements, known as GEM, Justice and Equality Movement, wrote an op-ed piece in a local newspaper asking the mediators to stop fighting. I mean, that is as excruciatingly embarrassing as it can get when the mediators themselves are in conflict with each other. Third dimension of the problem, in some instances, the mediating actor is itself a conflict party, which is outrageous. To imagine that the mediator can simultaneously be a conflict party. Russia, as a mediator in Syria, was itself a conflict party. In the case of South Sudan, 2013-2015, where the mediator was the regional body known as IGAD, IGAD's member states included countries that were militarily involved in the conflict and that were arming one or more of the domestic belligerent parties, which meant that the mediation lacked credibility and legitimacy and impartiality in the eyes of all its partners internationally and in the eyes of the domestic actors. And the fourth dimension of the problem is that these regional and global dimensions of domestic conflict also polarize and paralyze the UN Security Council. So the polarization in the field, in the killing field, gets transported to New York and makes the UN Security Council unable to fulfill its responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security because its members are divided. I said in my opening comments that the goal of our project is to help deepen understanding of the problem, but also to generate evidence-based solutions. So here we are interested in the ways in which mediators have successfully managed these regional and global dynamics. They haven't always been successful, but there are cases where they have. Cases where, for example, they have pursued different tracks sequentially, starting at the global level, then moving to the regional level, and only then to the domestic level, or even attempting to undertake mediation simultaneously through different tracks. President Thabo Mbeki of South Africa, for example, in relation to the Great War in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, pursued two tracks, one at the domestic level with the domestic actors, and one at the state level dealing with the regional states that had become belligerent parties. In our view, the UN should be doing a lot more to play a coordinating role. When there are multiple mediators and wannabe mediators, the UN is ultimately the convening and coordinating authority of last resort. And it ought to be more assertive in this regard. And that means the Secretary General ought to be more assertive in this regard. The Secretary General, through his or her special envoys and representatives, ought to be the coordinator that brings all the external actors together and insists that they follow the lead of the lead mediator and that they thrash out their differences in forums convened by the SG or his or her envoy. We also think that the UN Security Council needs to be more decisive and emphatic in passing resolutions that state unambiguously who the lead mediator is and the expectation of the Council that all other external actors get behind the lead mediator and support the lead mediator. There are positive examples of this happening. For the students amongst us at this meeting, and I end on this note, I encourage you to think not only about the scholarly research that you're doing, but about ways such as those that I've illustrated, you can do policy-oriented research, which will ultimately, we hope, be of benefit to policymakers and practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you. Laurie was just telling the students here to register for peace studies programs as supplementary major minor undergraduate. This is actually a requirement, and you cannot leave this room unless you do it. We're very peaceful people here. Anyway, thank you all really for your insightful thoughts about the report and the challenges of the globe. I want to give us an opportunity to reflect on each other's, on your own presentations. And if you have something you want to share with all of us, that's the moment to do so.
I can, I guess,
Sure.
same order. Yeah, I mean, I just had a couple of thoughts. So one, Josefina, when you sort of say the Secretary General's standing in the foothills. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, clearly he is. And I think the question is whether it's useful for him to provide a perspective from somewhere else, in the sense that I might want to hear it from him, but in his position, given the infrastructure he has, and being assertive in a paper like this, I'm not sure of the wisdom of it from a practical perspective. So I both like yearn for him to say more, and at the same time, Boutros Ghali, even in that context, didn't get a second term, right? In 92, and so just kind of thinking about the realities of his position. And then Laurie, I'm really interested in your work and the complexity issue of multiple mediators. I'm interested in how that problem has grown over time, and I think there's some analogs with like election monitors and other things. Do you think that this report is the place to be assertive about that? Or do you think perhaps that can happen without placing it in the context of a report like this? And might that happen otherwise? I'm more just curious because I'm really interested in the work you're mentioning.
Thank you.
Yes, no, what I was trying to say is exactly that there is no leadership. And so if you put forward an agenda where you're not the main, where you have so many stakeholders that you're trying to bring to your side, you need to have capital, you need to be convincing, you need to exercise power in a beyond political realism. And I just don't see that happening at the moment because it has been so delegitimized, and it has been delegitimized as by its own actions. And so if I was him, and if this was my last term, I would be pushing all the reforms, knowing that I'm not going to be reelected, knowing that I am just gonna leave it all on the ring. Because at this point, all of these agendas really require multilateralism. And I don't see him as a voice that unites people. I don't see him as a voice that is respected by civil society. I don't see him as a voice that is respected by the private sector. I don't also see him as a voice that is respected by academia. And so I think that lack of understanding that he's not just a bureaucrat, but he is a political leader, I think can be helpful to say at least some of these commitments can be materialized if you have enough support and if you create alliances and if you're able to lead, different platforms that require other types of stakeholders. They are not the nation states, because the nation states have certain interests, and it's easier to try to have the UN, I think, tilting the scale towards multilateralism has to do with a lot of political leadership, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you, Josephine. Myra, do you have anything you want to share with us?
Sure. I guess I just want to acknowledge or articulate what I think might be a tension between conceptions of conflict and conceptions that link climate change and conflict. And here I would love to hear from Lisa, from Laurie, from everyone really, on if on the ground and in your work, how this tension is articulated and how it becomes manifest. And what I'm really, the conception I'm trying to get at here is that in a lot of the environmental studies and climate literature, there is a tendency now, and there is the thrust of the work is to understand the long lineages, the slow violence, if you want, of climate change. So it's not just when, for example, a disaster event happens. And so I'm just wondering if there is a tension between these kinds of longer engagements with the slow development of something versus the requirements or the imperatives of policy intervention. Like how, for example, can there be international intervention into longer processes? And I say this and I'm going to end here, and I say this in particular because I thought it was very interesting the way that Laurie ended his comments, because this is something I constantly worry about and think about. What is the exchange relationship between scholarship and policy? And of course, this is not to say that there aren't people who are doing both. They are, there are people doing it, but I'm wondering if I'm trying to understand climate conflict might be one of those points which brings this tension out even more starkly. I'm sure it's, actually, I'm not sure. It might be reconcilable. Maybe it's not, maybe it is, but I would love to hear from anyone really on if you even recognize it as a tension. Is there even tension?
I mean, I wonder if you can still talk about slow violence. I mean, there is no slow in this form of violence. We're moving away from the slow violence paradigm to a very fast pace of violence. Obviously, we're connected to climate change. So even the time frame is changing.
That's that's true. And I guess one, if for example you look at the way that a lot of the conversations around the Syrian war happened, when attention turned to the fact that something had gone wrong was at the end or after a long process. So I think that's one example that's, and it's not even past, right? Like it's still like it's happening. As we speak. But I guess, and just like one intro note here is that, so the conception of slow violence, the way that it has been, very important in a lot of environmental studies, is it's attributed to Rob Nixon, for whom the foundation is in Galtung's notion of structural violence. And the effort was initially to direct attention to processes that unfold over time, that are harder in terms of their attention grabbing ability. And I think, of course, part of the question there has always been, from the very beginning, has been, so Nixon talks a lot about apprehension problems, about we're unable to apprehend these slow moving crises. And I think the question always has been, apprehending for whom? For whom is it hard to see? Who is not noticing certain things? And
yeah.
I will stop this time.
Thank you, Mara. Other thoughts from the panel before we move to?
I'll just briefly say, I have a little more compassion for him. I think I'm less critical of him because he has this huge job on page 1 of his speech about the new agenda for peace. He talks about trying to deal with the fact that humanity keeps creating new ways in which it can annihilate itself. And you just think about the last 30 years and you realize that's what humanity has done. We keep creating new tools to annihilate ourselves. And how can an institution like the United Nations keep up with these technological innovations? I want to say, though, that sitting here listening to you, Mara, I keep having this recurring dream. I'm sitting at my desk in the dream and I'm working on something on racial justice or technology, and the waves start coming in my office window. And it just feels like we need a leader who helps us prioritize what we need to work on and what we need to focus on. I think this document actually does a fairly good job of getting our attention on these are all the crises, and some of them are existential.
And can you imagine a realistic process that will help us transform the UN from what it is to what it should be? A realistic one, not a fantasy. That's, I think, the challenge of the day. Recognition that an organization such as the UN is necessary. It needs to be restructured. It needs to be reconfigured. And how do you do it from the position of the moment to the future, taking into account the power dynamics, the colonial legacy, and the waves that you just mentioned, that are just keep, and all of that you need to do soon. Laurie has a solution.
Yeah, right. Sorry to disappoint you, Asha, but I'm in fact going to take completely the opposite position. The international system has a primary characteristic, which is sovereignty. And, you know, I think it was Lisa who said this is medieval. It is medieval, but it has survived and been resilient for over 350 years. And it's not going away. And the UN is the epitome of this, especially with respect to peace and security and justice. The UN is, at the end of the day, a system of states, a collection of states, a forum of states who act in their national interests, and where they perceive collective interests, they act in their collective interests. I don't see any chance whatsoever in the foreseeable future that changing. That's not to say that we can't make improvements on the margins, but it's to say the essence of the beast is state sovereignty and its corollary, non-interference in domestic affairs. And it is reinforced by the members of the organization, which believe that their interests are, at the end of the day, upheld by respect for sovereignty and non-interference in domestic affairs. A principle which, by the way, is intended, at least in principle, to protect weak states against the predations and aggression of strong states, although in practice it doesn't work like that in all cases. But I think there is an important caveat here, and this is coming back to the question that Erin posed. The Secretary General is answerable at the end of the day to member states. He is beholden to member states. His secretariat depends on member states to fund their activities. But I think he has some well-established carve-out areas, one of which is referred to as the good offices of the Secretary General, which is the essential peacemaker role, where he is not meant to be beholden to member states, where he is entitled to some discretion and freedom of action. In that sense, the good offices of the SG are meant to escape the boundaries, the constraints of state sovereignty. I don't think the current SG is nearly courageous enough in exercising the good offices. They're not being exercised often enough, assertively enough. This is not to say you should be scolding and castigating, the villains, because that's not going to work to the advantage of good officers. I think also the UN and the SecGen in particular needs to play, as I said earlier, more assertively, a convening and coordinating role. It's not to take sides in a conflict. It's not to blame any of the actors. It's to say we, the UN, have a responsibility for international peace and security given to us in the Charter, therefore given to us by member states. And one of our functions in exercising that responsibility is to get everybody together behind the peace endeavor. And we're going to do that fearlessly and assertively.
Thank you, Laurie. I want to give the rest of the time the audience the opportunities to ask questions. Go ahead. You first, and then Hugo.
Thank you to everybody. It's very fascinating. I did only quickly read the last thing, so hopefully, speaking from everything I say is not wrong. But it's really for Josephina to talk about the inclusion of mention of sexual and reproductive health and domestic violence. So this would be, in some ways, talking to Laurie's point about piercing, would be piercing the concept of sovereignty. It's a talking about gendered violence in this way is a challenge to the traditional Security Council or the United Nations is intended to do, to be and certainly go beyond even what the Peace and Security agenda has said on long-standing recognition of the role of sexual violence plays in conflict all the way back to 2008 and now substantive part of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but that is very limited to conflict, and there has been a hesitation for the Security Council to refer to any sort of sexual gender-based violence that is a subset of what is already on the Security Council docket. But to speak to your point as well about whether it's how far is the Secretary General pushing this, would you, if you look at the latest resolutions from Peace and Security resolutions in 2018, there was really sort of subtle and not so subtle pushback by China, Russia, and the United States on what were really sort of established norms on both sexual violence, but also for social reproductive health. Could this introduction of recognition of both sexual health and reproductive health and domestic violence be a subtle challenge to those agendas that have been taken up by Russia, China, and the United States that are, I would argue, backtracking on the women, peace, and security agenda quite substantively, if not kind of another way. But I think I would argue those two a lot of have done a lot of damage both to United to the agenda itself, but also to the legitimacy of security.
Go ahead.
To answer that?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry, I thought we were connected. Thank you, Jenna, so much for your question. I think that the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which is already the result of a very similar to what Lisa was saying, the 1992 agenda, in a way puts forward an amazing amount of work by civil society the previous decades all over the world. And I think that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is something very similar. You have an amazing amount of conferences, civil society organizations, you have Beijing, you have the platforms in Africa, all of them coming together in 2000, having the main resolution and then everything that came afterwards. And I think that, at least for me, this has been an agenda that has always had, has always had a very strong basis in transnational civil society movements. You have a couple, of course, of Scandinavian countries who have taken the lead also when it comes to peacemaking, in being the guarantors of those agendas, and being, of course, not only, for example, in international development and cooperation agencies, being the ones who condition the use of funds to abiding by gender equality, or at least gender parity in all sorts of development and peace interventions. So all this to say that I believe that the WPS agenda is one of those agendas where you have more than, let's say, a top-down approach of the UN pushing an agenda on the nation states. What you have is the UN actually taking credit for an amazing transnational movement, in this case, especially the women's movement, of women civil society organizations that have pushed their own national governments and have bypassed those national governments. So in that sense, I do believe that you have, if you look at it this way, not that it's an agenda that was created in 2000 by the UN, it's also an agenda that crystallizes from 2000 onwards, but that really comes, I would say, from a transnational grassroots movement. What you see is you have all these grassroots organizations, and then you have the UN trying to, in a way, echo and amplify their message. But the ones who are in the middle, who continue to be the nation states and their governments, are the ones who really have an incredible amount of power. From, in this, I was rereading when you were talking, because especially here, and especially the 1325, speaks a lot about women in decision-making bodies and roles. So it's funny now that you mention it, the main title is about gender-based violence, but once you read it, it's about gender parity and gender equality in all these decision in these bodies for decision making. So I think that we have a very similar situation as we had over 23 years ago, in the sense that you have this movement and you have the United Nations trying to put pressure on the nation states, on the national governments, to stop discriminating against women, to put women at risk in terms of their health, to deprive women of services that we can consider human rights. But above all, to prevent women from speaking up and making decisions and coming to the decision-making bodies that at the national level are preventing them from fully accessing their rights. So I would say it's a continuation of that. What surprised me when I read this is the recognition of the lack of implementation of the WPS, because in general terms, the UN tends to be very, I would say it praises itself very often on the success of the WPS, but it's one of their flagship. It's one of those things that they carry with a lot of pride, and I think it's important to see how that particular agenda always comes to a blockage when it comes to the national action plans. So we're back to the figure of the nation state and how the nation state prevents real transformation in those power relations.
Thank you. Hugo, please.
Thank you, Arthur, for putting here to organize this special event. I have a question for Maida and I think Lisa, which is like, given the conflicts, the armed conflicts over the environment and the lack of water due to the climate change, do you think we should move in thinking of modification in the Rome Statute regarding to including the destruction of the environment as a war crime? And I say here because in the Tribunal for Peace, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace in Colombia, we already accused party members for this type of crime. And also we're thinking like in reparations to the environment as a sanction.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question, and I think that I would respond in an unsatisfactory way by saying at the outset that, so for example, if something is a conflict over water, and I mean, you know this, better than I do, is that my understanding or my approach is that, yes, there might be, for example, water conflicts, but that they are always very local. They are always very contextualized. And so the particular legal instruments or histories or players that are involved are unique in each case. What I can say a little bit more about is this water conflict that I have been trying to understand for a while now, which is one realm of it is between India and Pakistan. And so the kinds of instruments, legal and otherwise, that are at play there, they sort of run a whole gamut from international, from how they were negotiated to negotiations that then happened within these countries between their own provinces. And so that in a way, it is all connected very materially. Given that, for example, we can call this a fantasy, but basically the numerical fantasy at work here is, this is the quantum of water that we are going to get from the upper riparian. Now that quantum of water is going to be distributed among our provinces. Now when that quantum changes, and it changes because of rainfall changes, it changes because of variations that are only becoming more intense because of climate change. Of course, the quantum that's then being distributed also changes. And so how these sorts of variations feed into existing conflicts, either exacerbating old ones, making old fault lines more stark, but also, I think, feeding into and having the potential to highlight new ones, remains to be empirically investigated. Empirically investigated and examined. And so and that's why I said, I think unsatisfactory, in that I don't think, or at least I don't know about, or I'm not comfortable about saying this particular way or this particular instrument can help deal with these kinds of issues in all settings. I feel like I would need to know a lot more about different settings to be able to say more. So.
Question. Yes, Tekla, please. Then.
Thank you so much. And I certainly acknowledge the document, but from the practical point of view, when we talk about the UN mediating and knowing that the UN is made of member states.
I think Lori
Yeah.
doesn't hear you well, and you may want
Do
to
you
raise your
wanna
hand.
come here? Is this?
You're good? No, Lori said that she's
Okay.
fine. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, Lori. When you call upon the UN to participate in the mediation, reflecting from the civil society point of view, when we were dealing with peace building with our conflicts in the early 1990s, I feel that we are back there. We are now dealing with a world that is almost going back to the Cold War era. And we know that during the Cold War era, especially the international community, the so-called UN, didn't care about what was happening in Africa until after the break of the Soviet Union. Then they started noticing and supporting us to intervene in the conflict. With what is going on in the West, with the division, we now hear about the BRICS. Is it the BRIC or the BRICS? Do you think that this is even going to present more challenge or challenges when it comes to mediating? And most of the conflicts we are talking about, actually we are talking about conflicts in Africa. And most of them are intra-conflicts. I was coming from the airport and the Uber person that I hired was from Sudan. And he told me, hey, tell your president to keep out of Sudan. We know who funded this election. So I think it's even getting more complicated. Thank you.
Thank you. Lori, do you want to respond or just nod?
Let me say, I agree that it's becoming more complicated. And I think what you said about the Kenyan president who wants to deploy a regional force in Sudan is exactly the kind of problem that we're trying to understand and address. It makes the life of the mediator, the lead mediator, really difficult when there are these kind of proposals. And I think it's exactly where the UN needs to be more assertive, even if it's not leading the mediation, because in many instances, the UN will respect the principle of subsidiarity in peacemaking, which means they will allow the sub-regional body or the regional body to lead the mediation. Nonetheless, the UN needs to be saying out loud, we want everybody involved in this conflict on the side of peace to speak with one voice, to be coordinated, to be cooperative, to work in support of the lead mediator. I think the UN needs to be assertive. But if I can add a positive note, in case my earlier comments were too pessimistic about reform or lack of reform at the UN, politics is always at the domestic and international level a matter of contestation. It's never static. And to put it in kind of crude metaphysical terms, it's about the forces of good up against the forces of darkness. And we may not, as the forces of good, win in all cases, but if we surrender the ground, if we give up, then the forces of darkness prevail. This is true of power, and it's true of ideas, and it's true of norms. The UN's normative agenda has moved in a progressive direction since the founding of the UN. Why is that? It's because norm advocates on human rights, on rule of law, on gender issues, on climate have pushed the UN in a progressive direction. But that's not to say that the battle is always over or that we achieve the forces of good final victory or permanent victory. The forces of darkness, to put it in those terms, are pushing back. And so we, whether we scholars or students or activists or civil society or progressive states, we need to be engaged in the struggle within the UN and around the UN to assert progressive agendas. That doesn't mean we're always going to win, but if we don't, we will always lose. So I'm encouraging us not to be pessimistic, but to have an activist orientation and engaged in the struggle.
Thank you, Laurie. Question here.
Yeah, thank you, Asher. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Maria. I come from Colombia, and I just wanted to bring in another perspective because I would say Colombia is right now having a small story of hope for peace, and it has a lot to do also with the support we have given by the United Nations since the last 6 or 8 years. So it's not the case for every place in the world. There are a lot of other Colombians in the room, maybe, but the UN Security Council has played a decisive role in our peace agreement. The whole demobilization process and the new negotiations that are opening right now in Colombia, they have all this company of the UN, and this is very important for a lot of Colombians to trust the negotiation because the UN is involved. Now they have a broadened mandate in Colombia, also for transitional justice issues with the jurisdiction for peace. So it's really interesting for me. It was not the case like 10 years ago. They didn't have this legitimacy they have right now. But I would say, even though it is very, it costs a lot. They also have they build up a multi-partner trust fund in order to coordinate the different donors in Colombia for peace building, and all that is working really good in the last 10 years. So I just wanted to share. It's really interesting to see how globally it feels like a lot of things are still to be done, and when things about Russia and Ukraine. That's one perspective, but if I just look at the Colombian case in the last 6 years, it has been very, very successful. So just another element to compare and analyze.
Thank you. There is a question there, and then the last one over there. So go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. My name is Rebecca. I'm my first year IPS MGA. My question is related to the one of Professor Josephine, and is directed to Rory regarding the UN. The UN Security Council is made of mainly powerful, what we can call powerful countries, and we don't have big countries, mainly of Africa. So how does the Secretary General expect to get sustainable development when the decisions are made without the consent of the affected people? Like, for example, I know the peacekeeping, I was in the peacekeeping, they operate in terms of mandates. So when they are drafting those mandates, the affected countries, they are not invited. So how do they expect to get results if the people who are affected are not invited? How do they plan to review their policy in terms of peacekeeping? Thank you. That was the question.
That will be the end, unfortunately, the last question because of our time.
I have class. I have to leave. Sorry.
Thank you, Lisa, very much.
Back there.
Laurie, do you want to?
Yeah. So there's an interesting distinction between the UN Secretariat and the UN Security Council with regard to the question that was posed about peacekeeping in Africa. The Secretariat now makes a very real effort to engage in meaning proper substantive partnerships with the African Union. The Secretariat does not want to be involved in anything, including peacekeeping, without a partnership with the AU and or partnership with one of the sub-regional bodies. But that is not necessarily the view of the UN Security Council and of the P5, the permanent 5 members in particular, that are sometimes quite disdainful of the African voice. And this has posed a severe political crisis for the UN Security Council in respect of certain conflicts. For example, Libya 2011, where the Council approved enforcement action in the context of an emerging civil war in Libya, contrary to the African Union emphasis on mediation. It really damaged the relationship. So I'm drawing a distinction between the Secretariat and the Council. I would also say that while in Africa, I'm a South African, we complain justifiably about UN Security Council disdain for the continent. We also have to get our own act together in Africa. I mean, it's easy for us to blame the UN, but for as long as we are not united in Africa, and our countries, our governments are not united, and our governments are fighting and undermining each other, we don't speak with one voice. And as a relatively weak continent, we weaken ourselves even further. We lose what little leverage we have through our own lack of unity. And a further problem is that we are completely dependent on foreigners, mainly European Union and the US, to fund our peace operations. It's not true that we are too poor to fund our own peace operations in Africa. We choose not to. We choose to put out the begging bowl and take money from the West. And therefore, they have leverage and are able to dictate to us how we should be doing our peace operations. So we should end that problem and fund our own peace work. That would give us greater regional and continental autonomy. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to thank the panelists and to thank you all for coming for this panel. We did not create, we did not contribute to the non-existent ceasefire, but I hope we did our share in education and informing us more about the global challenges. And if you would like to learn more and hear more and be involved in the work of the Kroc Institute, I invite you to take our classes and come to our events if you have not done so already. Thank you all and have a good rest of your day.